Hi guys, welcome to the Quiet Past Historical Channel. Tonight, you are stepping into something very old, not a museum, not a lecture hall, not a list of dates and dynasties. You are stepping into the hour just before sleep as it was lived thousands of years ago in rooms lit by oil lamps on beds of woven reeds under skies that no one had yet named in the way we name them now. For as long as human beings have existed, there has been this moment, this threshold. The place between the waking world and whatever waits beyond it. And for thousands of years, some of the wisest people who ever lived thought very carefully about this moment. They wrote about it, they argued about it. They built entire systems of thought around what it meant to sleep well, to dream honestly, and to wake renewed. Tonight, we are going to visit them. We will move slowly. There is no rush here. We will pass through ancient China and sit with philosophers who watched the breath move in and out of sleeping scholars. We will walk through the evening routines of Egyptian priests who prepared for the night with the same care they gave to prayer. We will find ourselves in a Greek physician's consulting room, where a man named Hippocrates was already asking questions about sleep that we are still answering today. We will sit beside Indian sages who believed the whole universe rested when the mind finally let go. There is a great deal of ground to cover, and we will cover all of it slowly, gently, the way the night itself arrives. So find a comfortable position, let your body settle, and let's begin. The Yellow Emperor's Night we begin in China, not the China of the Great Wall or the Forbidden City, but a much older and quieter China. A China of river valleys and pine forests, of small candles burning in rooms with curved wooden ceilings, of scholars who wrote on silk and read by the last light of evening before rolling their manuscripts carefully and setting them aside for morning. The story of sleep in ancient China begins, as so many Chinese stories do, with a text. And this particular text is one of the oldest medical documents in the world. It is called the Huangdi Nijing. In English, we usually call it the Yellow Emperor's Classic of Internal Medicine, or sometimes simply the Yellow Emperor's Classic. It was compiled and written over many centuries, the earliest portions probably dating to somewhere between 300 and 100 BCE, though parts of it may contain ideas far older than that, ideas passed down through generations of physicians and teachers before anyone thought to write them down on silk or bamboo. The Yellow Emperor himself, Huangdi, is a legendary figure. Whether he was a real historical person or a mythological composite, we cannot say with certainty. But in the text that bears his name, he appears as a thoughtful and genuinely curious ruler who sits with his chief physician, a man called Qi, and asks him the kinds of questions that a wise person asks when they begin to take their health seriously. And one of the questions the Yellow Emperor asks, one of the most important questions in the entire text, is this: why do people need to sleep? Qi's answer is long and careful and deeply rooted in the philosophy of the time. To understand it, we need to understand something about how ancient Chinese thinkers understood the body. In their view, the body was not a machine. It was a landscape. Through this landscape moved a vital force, a kind of energy called qi. Qi is one of those words that resists clean translation. It has been rendered as breath, as vital energy, as life force, as air. None of these quite captures it. What it meant in the medical context was something like the animating current that ran through all living things, and which, when it flowed freely and in balance, produced health, clarity, and ease. The body had pathways through which qi moved. These pathways were called meridians, a word we still use today in acupuncture. And throughout the day, qi moved along these meridians in a particular rhythm, visiting different organs, different systems in a slow and orderly circulation. During sleep, something important happened to this circulation. During sleep, according to the Huangdi Nijing, the qi withdrew. It pulled back from the surface of the body, from the limbs and the skin and the eyes, and moved inward to nourish the organs, to repair what had been worn down by the work of waking, to replenish what the day had spent. This is why the eyes close during sleep. Qi has withdrawn from them. This is why the body becomes still. Qi is no longer animating the limbs for movement. This is why the skin becomes cool and the hands relax and the jaw unclenches. The vital force has turned its attention inward, away from the world, toward the quiet interior where the deepest work of maintenance occurs. In the Yellow Emperor's Classic, there is a great deal of attention paid to the timing of sleep. The Chinese medical tradition understood time, both the time of year and the time of day, as having its own quality of qi. There were times that were naturally expansive and outward-facing, and times that were naturally contractive and inward-facing. The midday sun was expansive. The midnight hour was deeply inward, and the body, if it was wise, would align itself with these rhythms. Sleeping when the night was deep, and waking when the dawn brought yang energy back into the world, this was considered not merely a matter of personal preference but a form of cooperation with the universe, a way of moving with the tide rather than against it. The Yellow Emperor's classic describes what happens to people who persistently fight this rhythm. Their qi becomes disordered. Their organs, deprived of the deep nighttime nourishment they require, begin to struggle. The person becomes irritable, unfocused, easily upset by small things. Their digestion weakens, their complexion dulls. The light behind their eyes, a quality the ancient Chinese physicians specifically observed and recorded, literally looking at the eyes of patients as a diagnostic tool, begins to dim. These descriptions, written over 2,000 years ago, read today like a fairly accurate account of chronic sleep deprivation. And the cure in the Yellow Emperor's tradition was not medicine. Not primarily, the cure was sleep, but not just any sleep. The right kind of sleep at the right time, in the right relationship to the rest of the day. Let us imagine for a moment the evening routine of a scholar in Han Dynasty China, roughly the period from 206 BCE to 220 CE, when many of these texts were being circulated and read. He lives in a modest house in a provincial town. The house has a courtyard at its center, open to the sky, and around the courtyard are several small rooms, a study, a room for eating, a sleeping room. The walls are made of tamped earth and clay, and in the evening they hold the warmth of the day for a long time before finally releasing it. The scholar has been working since before sunrise. He has read, written, perhaps met with students. He has eaten 2 meals. The ancient Chinese generally ate twice a day, not 3 times. And now, as the shadows of the courtyard lengthen and the sky turns from the pale blue of late afternoon to the deeper, grayer blue of early evening, he begins the process of preparing for night. He puts away his brushes. He rolls his manuscript carefully and ties it with a piece of cord. He washes his hands and face in cool water from a clay basin. In his sleeping room, which is separate from his study, there is a bed frame of lacquered wood raised from the floor on short legs. On the frame is a mat woven from dried plant fibers, rush or bamboo, depending on the season, and over the mat a thin quilt stuffed with silk floss. In winter there would be heavier quilts, sometimes several of them. In summer, just the mat. There is no pillow as we would recognize it. There is something closer to a headrest, a small block of ceramic or lacquered wood, sometimes padded with a thin cushion of silk. These headrests appear frequently in paintings and tomb objects from this period. They were treasured possessions, sometimes carved with scenes from nature or inscribed with short poems. A good headrest might be passed down through several generations of a family. The scholar lies down on his right side, as the Yellow Emperor's classic recommends, with his legs slightly bent and his right hand resting near his face. This position, the physicians believed, kept the heart from being pressed and allowed the stomach to empty naturally downward. Lying on the left side was considered acceptable but less ideal. Lying on the back was reserved for meditation and formal rest, not for ordinary sleep, because it kept the body in too active and alert a posture. Breathe slowly. Outside in the courtyard there is the small sound of water in a clay pot and a cricket somewhere near the corner of the wall. The candle in his room has already been extinguished. The ancient Chinese were attentive about this. Sleeping with a flame burning was considered both a fire hazard and a disruption to the body's natural withdrawal. The light kept a small part of the senses awake and vigilant, which interfered with the full inward turning of qi. In the darkness, the scholar breathes. And slowly, as the night deepens around him, sleep comes. The Huangdi Nijing describes sleep itself as a kind of journey, not quite a metaphor, not quite a physiological description, something in between. During deep sleep, the spirit called Shen, which normally resided in the heart, was thought to travel or to rest in a different way from the body's resting. This is partly why dreams were considered meaningful. They were in some sense the reports that the Shen brought back from wherever it went in the night. But even more important than dreams was the quality of the sleep itself. A person who slept deeply and woke refreshed was considered to be in good relationship with their qi. A person who slept lightly, who woke often, who tossed and moved through the night, or who woke in the early hours with a racing mind, that person had a disruption somewhere in their system, and the physician's job was to find it. The ancient Chinese medical tradition catalogued these disruptions with remarkable specificity. Waking between 11 at night and 1 in the morning, the hour associated with the gallbladder in the meridian system, suggested a problem with decision-making, with the capacity to choose and commit. Not metaphorically but actually, the gallbladder in Chinese medical thought governed the ability to make clear judgments, and when it was out of balance, the mind returned to unresolved decisions in the small hours. Waking between 1 and 3 in the morning, the liver's hour suggested suppressed anger or an overtaxed system struggling to process the emotional residue of the day. Between 3 and 5, the lung hour often indicated grief or a constitutional tendency towards sadness. These correlations may or may not hold up to modern scrutiny, but what is remarkable about them is the underlying assumption that sleep disruptions were not random, that when the body woke itself at a particular time, it was communicating something, that the night was not empty, it was full of information if you knew how to listen. In the same tradition, there were extensive writings about what to do and not do in the hours before sleep. Eating too heavily in the evening was cautioned against. This idea appears in so many ancient medical traditions that it begins to feel less like cultural advice and more like a persistent human discovery, something our ancestors figured out over and over again across centuries and continents, simply by paying attention to how they felt. The ancient Chinese physicians recommended eating the evening meal at least 2 hours before lying down and eating lightly, rice porridge, steamed vegetables, a small amount of fish, perhaps a thin soup. Nothing rich, nothing that would require the digestive organs to work hard through the night when they should be resting. Drinking cold water before sleep was cautioned against. The stomach was considered a warm organ that needed warmth to function well, and cold water shocked it into a kind of defensive response that could disturb the whole system. Warm water or warm tea made from dried dates or goji berries was preferable. Emotional agitation before sleep was considered one of the more serious disruptors. The Yellow Emperor's Classic and its commentaries return to this point again and again. The mind should be quieted before the body lies down. Anger brought to bed would keep the liver working through the night. Worry brought to bed would tax the spleen, the organ associated with rumination and anxious thinking. Grief brought to bed would trouble the lungs. The remedy was not to suppress these emotions, but to process them enough through quiet sitting, through slow breathing, through conversation with a trusted person, so that they did not arrive in the sleeping room at their full intensity. There was a phrase that appears in various forms across several ancient Chinese medical and philosophical texts. The bedroom is not the place for unfinished business. The scholar, lying in his dark room with the cricket still chirping somewhere outside, has taken this seriously. He has finished his business for the day, or as much of it as can be finished. He has set aside the problems he cannot solve tonight. He has, in a very practical sense, closed the doors of his mind the way he closed the doors of his house. Not against anything, but simply because some things are for daytime and some things are for night. And in that quiet and orderly darkness, the qi begins its inward journey. And sleep comes. There is one more element of the ancient Chinese sleep tradition worth lingering with before we move on. It is the concept of wu-wei, non-doing or effortless action as it applies to sleep. Wu-wei is a concept from Taoist philosophy, articulated most beautifully in the Tao Te Ching, attributed to the sage Lei Yazi, probably composed somewhere around the 4th or 5th century BCE. In its most general sense, wu-wei describes a way of engaging with the world that works with the natural current of things rather than against it. Not passivity exactly, more like the art of not forcing. And when applied to sleep, wu-wei had a very specific meaning. You cannot make yourself sleep. This is a truth that anyone who has ever lain awake at 3 in the morning, desperately willing themselves into unconsciousness, knows with a kind of bitter certainty. Sleep cannot be seized, it cannot be commanded. It arrives on its own terms, and the harder you pursue it, the faster it recedes. The Taoist perspective on this was that sleep, like so many things in nature, was a natural process that was disrupted specifically by the effort to control it. The solution was not a better strategy. The solution was less strategy. The solution was to create the conditions, dark room, still body, quiet mind, the right hour, and then to release the desire for a particular outcome, not to try to fall asleep, To simply lie there, to be as the river at night, not going anywhere, not trying to go anywhere, but present and still and allowing the current beneath to move as it will. This sounds simple. It is, in practice, one of the more difficult things a human being can do. But the ancient Chinese sages wrote about it not as an achievement, but as a return to something natural, something that the body already knew how to do if the mind would only stop interfering. The scholar in his dark room breathes. The cricket chirps twice more, then falls silent. The chi moves inward like water finding its deepest course. And the night holds everything gently. The Egyptian night, and as the night deepens, we travel west and south. Across the wide steppes of Central Asia, across the warm, stone-colored lands of the ancient Middle East, down through the Sinai and into the valley of the Nile, where the river moves slowly between its green banks and the stars above the desert are so bright and so numerous that they seem almost to weigh on the darkness. Ancient Egypt. The civilization that built the pyramids carved its history into stone walls and believed, with a seriousness and consistency maintained over 3,000 years, that the boundary between the living world and the world of the dead was permeable, thin, and passable in certain ways. Sleep was one of those ways. The ancient Egyptian word for sleep was khed, and the act of sleeping was understood to be a small, temporary version of death, not morbidly but practically. During sleep, the ba, one of several elements that made up the Egyptian understanding of the soul, was thought to leave the body and travel. It could visit other places, other people, other realms, and when it returned at waking, it brought impressions back with it. These impressions were dreams. The ancient Egyptians took dreams with extraordinary seriousness. There are dream interpretation manuals surviving from ancient Egypt that predate the more famous Greek and Roman ones by many centuries. One of the most important is known as the Chester Beatty Papyrus III, dating to around 1275 BCE, the Ramesside period, when Egypt was at the height of its New Kingdom power. This papyrus contains interpretations of hundreds of different dream scenarios, organized systematically, as if it were a reference work designed to be consulted. In these interpretations, dreams were divided into two basic categories: good dreams and bad dreams, with the understanding that the meaning was rarely literal. Dreaming of a specific action, of seeing your face in a mirror, of eating a donkey's flesh, of climbing a mast, each had its interpreted significance, carefully catalogued. But the dream manuals were only part of the story. For the priests and the nobility, and eventually, in some periods, for ordinary people as well, there was another practice altogether. It was called incubation. Incubation, from the Latin incubare, to lie upon, was the practice of sleeping in a sacred place with the deliberate intention of receiving a divine dream. A dream that would answer a question, heal a sickness, or provide guidance on a difficult matter. In ancient Egypt, the temples were the sites of incubation. And the experience of sleeping in a temple was not quite like sleeping anywhere else. Let us imagine an Egyptian who has come to the temple complex at Deir el-Medina, the village where the workers who built the Valley of the Kings lived, just across the Nile from Luxor, on a night sometime around 1200 BCE. She is a woman, perhaps in her late 30s, the wife of a craftsman. She has been troubled by a recurring dream, something she cannot interpret, something that has been disturbing her sleep for weeks. She has made an offering at the local shrine, spoken to the village priest, and been given permission to spend a night in the incubation chamber of the temple. She arrives as the sun is setting. The air is still warm from the day, dry and carrying the faint mineral smell of the desert mixed with the cool green smell of the Nile, which is close enough that she can hear its subtle sound against the reeds at the bank. The temple is small by Egyptian standards, not the grand complexes of Karnak or Luxor, but a modest building of limestone blocks with a low entrance and a courtyard open to the sky. Inside, the walls are covered in painted reliefs, gods with animal heads and human bodies, scenes of offering and harvest and battle and healing, all picked out in red ochre and yellow and blue faience and black. She brings a small offering, a clay figurine she has made herself, painted with stripes of color and fitted with a clay offering bowl. She places it in the niche designated for such things, and the priest speaks brief words over it. Then she is led to the incubation chamber. It is a small room off the main hall. There is a low stone platform along one wall, covered with a reed mat and a thin linen sheet. The room smells of incense, kaifi, a specific Egyptian blend of 16 ingredients including honey, wine, raisins, myrrh and spikenard, used specifically in religious and healing contexts. The smell is heavy and sweet and slightly resinous, and it fills the small room completely, so that breathing becomes itself a kind of slow immersion. An oil lamp in a niche gives off a small, warm light. The flame barely moves. She lies down on the mat. The priest who led her here speaks quietly for a moment, a formula, a prayer, an invocation of the god or goddess whose aid she is seeking. In this particular temple, the presiding deity of healing dreams is Hathor, the goddess of love and music and healing, depicted with the head of a cow or with cow's ears, surrounded in the paintings on the wall by her characteristic symbols. The Menat necklace, the sistrum rattle, the golden disc. The prayer ends, the priest leaves, and she is alone in the small room with the lamp and the incense and the painted eyes of the goddess watching her from the wall. What happened in the incubation chamber was not passive. The sleeper was expected to cooperate with the process. Specific postures were recommended, sometimes lying on the left side, which was associated with the heart, with feeling, with the receptive quality needed to receive divine communication. Sometimes lying on the back, hands open at the sides, palms facing up, in a posture of openness and surrender. Before sleeping, the person was sometimes instructed to meditate on a specific question, to hold it in the mind not with anxious urgency, but with a kind of gentle, sustained attention, like cupping water in your hands. The incense served multiple purposes. Its smell was pleasant and calming, which helped the body relax. But it also had, in the Egyptian understanding, a specifically sacred quality. Incense smoke was considered a medium of communication between the human and divine realms. The smoke carried prayers upward, and perhaps in the understanding of the priests, it also opened something in the sleeper, softened some internal boundary that made dreaming more accessible. Whether the dreams that came were genuinely divine, whether the goddess Hathor truly visited the sleeping woman in the incubation chamber, is not a question we can answer from here. What we can say is that many people across many centuries reported receiving meaningful dreams in these spaces. They came with questions and left with answers, or at least with images and symbols that the dream interpreters could work with. The process was taken seriously enough that some temples employed professional dream interpreters, priests and sometimes priestesses whose specific role was to help people understand what they had received in the night. These interpreters appear in temple records, in administrative papyri, in inscriptions. They were recognized specialists. They had a title sometimes translated as the seers of the hour, which implies that part of their skill was knowing not just what a dream meant, but when in the cycle of a person's life, in the cycle of the year, in the larger rhythms of divine time, the meaning was most relevant. Beyond the temples, the ordinary Egyptian's relationship with sleep had its own careful rituals. Ancient Egyptian houses, at least the houses of those prosperous enough to leave traces in the archaeological record, typically had a sleep area that was somewhat separated from the living areas. In modest houses, this might just be a raised platform in the back of the main room. In wealthier homes, there might be a dedicated sleeping room or an upper floor chamber. The beds of wealthy Egyptians are among the most beautifully preserved artifacts from the ancient world. The tomb of Tutankhamun, the young pharaoh who died around 1323 BCE, contains several beds, each made of gilded wood with legs carved in the shapes of animal limbs, the folded legs of a lion, the hooves of a cow, the clawed feet of a ceremonial beast. The sleeping surface was a woven mesh of plant fibers, slightly concave, following the natural curve of the body. There was no pillow in the modern sense. Instead, a headdress in Egyptian called a wurz was used. These headdresses survive in enormous quantities in Egyptian museums worldwide. They range from simple curved pieces of wood or ivory to extraordinarily elaborate objects of faience and gold, carved with protective spells, inlaid with figures of the god Bes, a dwarf deity with a leonine face who was specifically associated with the protection of sleepers, of children, and of women in childbirth. Bes is one of the most fascinating figures in the Egyptian divine pantheon precisely because he was so domestic. The great gods of Egypt, Osiris, Isis, Ra, Horus, were worshipped in grand temples with elaborate state rituals. Bes was worshipped in the home. His image was placed in bedrooms, carved onto the headrests, painted on the walls of sleeping chambers. He was the god you prayed to, not in the public space of the temple, but in the quiet privacy of your own bedroom, in the moments before sleep when you were most vulnerable. Because the ancient Egyptians were very clear about the vulnerability of sleep. When the ba left the body during the night, the body itself was exposed. It could be approached by spirits, by the troubled dead, by hostile forces that moved more freely in darkness. The protective spells inscribed on headrests, the image of Bes watching from the wall, the amulets worn at the throat or placed beneath the sleeping mat. All of these were part of a system of nighttime protection that the Egyptians maintained with the same care they gave to the doors of their houses. There are surviving papyri containing what might be called anti-nightmare spells, spoken formulas designed to be recited before sleep to protect against bad dreams, to ward off the hostile entities that might be responsible for disturbing the night. Some of these spells are quite practical in their imagery. They call on the goddess Isis, who in mythological tradition was the great healer and the protector of her murdered husband Osiris, to stand guard at the head of the bed. They invoke the 4 protective deities of the cardinal points. They describe the sleeper as being enclosed in light, in warmth, in divine protection. Whether you believe in the metaphysics or not, there is something deeply soothing about this practice. The idea that before you close your eyes, you explicitly place yourself in the care of something larger than yourself, that you do not go into the night alone. The Egyptian priests who served in the temples, specifically the Wab priests, the pure priests who performed a daily ritual service, had perhaps the most regulated sleep routines of anyone in the ancient world. Their lives were structured around a cycle of ritual purity that governed nearly everything they did, what they ate, when they bathed, how they dressed, when they could enter sacred spaces, and sleep was part of this cycle. A Wab priest serving in a major temple like Karnak at Luxor would have slept in the temple precinct during his period of service, typically a month on followed by 3 months off, though the exact rotation varied by period and by temple. During his month of service, he lived in rooms within the temple complex, separated from his family, observing dietary restrictions: no fish, no pork, no legumes, no foods considered heavy or corrupting, and maintaining a state of ritual cleanliness that required regular bathing and specific ablutions before and after sleep. The sleeping routine of a temple priest involved something that we might today recognize as a form of meditation. Before lying down, the priest would sit in a specific posture, cross-legged or kneeling back straight, and recite a series of invocations, prayers, and protective formulas. These were not improvised. They were memorized texts, the same words spoken in the same order night after night for the duration of his service. The repetition was the point. The repetition created a kind of groove in the mind, a well-worn channel through which the attention could flow easily without the effort of finding its way. The priests understood, apparently by experience, that a mind given a familiar and comforting sequence to follow would settle more easily than a mind left to its own devices. And a settled mind, they believed, was more receptive to whatever communication the night might bring. After the recitation, the priest would lie down on his simple wooden bed, no elaborate gilded frame for the temple servants, just functional sleeping furniture, and continue to breathe slowly and consciously for some time before allowing sleep to arrive. This practice of conscious breathing before sleep appears, as we will see, in several ancient traditions quite independently of one another. There is something here that seems to have been discovered and rediscovered by people paying close attention to what helped and what didn't. Slow breathing helps. And in the quiet of the temple, with the sound of the Nile through the stone walls and the smell of incense still drifting from the ritual chambers, the priest breathed. And the night held the temple and the desert held the night. Before we leave Egypt, one more figure deserves our attention. Not a priest, not a pharaoh, a physician. Ancient Egypt had a sophisticated medical tradition that ran alongside its religious one, and the two were never fully separated. The physician Imhotep, who served the pharaoh Djoser around 2650 BCE, and who was so revered that he was later deified, worshipped for centuries after his death as a god of medicine and wisdom, he is often cited as the first physician whose name we know. Whether that is precisely accurate is debated, But what is not debated is that he represented a tradition of medical thinking that included careful observation of the body, including its sleeping patterns. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, one of the oldest surviving medical texts in the world, probably copied around 1600 BCE from even older sources that may date to Imhotep's era, deals primarily with surgical cases, wounds, fractures, dislocations. But scattered through the Egyptian medical papyri more broadly are references to sleep disturbances, their causes and their treatments. The treatments were often a combination of practical and ritual, herbal preparations alongside spoken spells, physical adjustment alongside divine invocation. A person who could not sleep might be given a drink of lettuce water. The ancient Egyptians believed strongly in the sleep-inducing properties of lettuce, which they associated with the fertility god Min, and also have their room cleaned and ray-scented, and also have a protective spell spoken over them by a priest. The integration of these approaches reflected not a confusion of categories but a genuine philosophical position, that human beings were simultaneously physical, emotional, and spiritual creatures, and that sleep, which touched all three of these dimensions simultaneously, required attention at all three levels. The body needed to be comfortable and fed appropriately. The emotions needed to be settled. The spirit needed to be protected and received. Only when all three were in order could the night be what it was meant to be, and so the Egyptian night settles. The oil lamp in the incubation chamber has burned down to a small, warm glow. The woman on the reed mat breathes slowly, the smell of kaifi filling her lungs with every breath. On the wall, the painted eyes of Hathor watch over her in the darkness, and somewhere, very quietly, the Nile moves between its banks. The Greek understanding, meanwhile, in another quiet corner of history across the Mediterranean Sea, where the water is so blue in summer that it seems almost solid, and the limestone hills catch the afternoon light in a way that turns them the color of old bone. In ancient Greece, someone was thinking about sleep differently, not through divine dreams and temple rituals, though the Greeks had those too, but through observation, through logic, through the careful accumulation of what we might today recognize as clinical evidence. His name was Hippocrates. Hippocrates of Kos was born around 460 BCE on the island of Kos off the southwestern coast of what is now Turkey. He lived to an extraordinary age. Some ancient sources put it at over 90 years, possibly over 100, though ancient ages are always to be treated with some caution. He practiced medicine, taught medicine, and wrote, or was associated with the writing of a large body of texts that became the foundation of Western medical tradition for over 2,000 years. The Hippocratic corpus, as this body of texts is called, contains works on everything from epidemic diseases to surgical wounds to the treatment of fractures. And it contains several passages scattered across different texts, not gathered in a single dedicated treatise, that address sleep with considerable sophistication. For Hippocrates, sleep was a physiological event, not a divine journey, not a spiritual practice. A natural process of the body governed by natural principles which could be observed, analyzed, and when disrupted, treated by natural means. This was, for its time, a significant shift. It did not eliminate the religious understanding of dreams. Hippocrates and the physicians of his tradition still took dream content seriously as diagnostic information, but it placed the mechanism of sleep firmly in the physical body rather than in the realm of divine intervention. And what Hippocrates observed about sleep was in many respects remarkably accurate. He noted that sleep occurred when warmth and moisture withdrew from the extremities of the body into the interior. This is not identical to the Chinese concept of Qi's inward movement, but the structural similarity is striking. Both traditions independently described sleep as a kind of centripetal movement, a gathering in of the body's vital resources from the periphery toward the center. He observed that sleeping too much was as unhealthy as sleeping too little, a point his successors Aristotle and Galen would both emphasize. He noted that the quality of sleep varied depending on diet, season, age, and temperament. Young children slept more than adults. Old people slept less and more lightly. People who ate rich food had heavy, often disturbing dreams. People who ate lightly and temperately slept more cleanly. He noted that sleep improved after exercise. Specifically, he recommended walking as the most beneficial form of physical activity for most people, and recommended it in the late afternoon after the main meal had had time to begin digesting, so that the body arrived at bedtime neither overfull nor overexerted. He noted that anxiety and worry were among the most significant disruptors of sleep, and he addressed this not by prescribing sedatives, though he was aware of the sleep-inducing properties of certain plants, but by recommending what we might now call lifestyle adjustments, regular routine, moderate habits, the avoidance of strong emotional disturbance in the hours before bed. Let us spend a little time in Hippocrates' consulting room or something close to it. The physician's work on the island of Kos was conducted in what was called an iatraion, a medical office or clinic, typically a room in the physician's house or a space set aside in the public area of a town. The waiting room was outside in a shaded colonnade. Patients sat on stone benches in the filtered light, listening to the sounds of the town around them. The distant hammer of a craftsman, the voices of children, the slow movement of donkeys on the street. Inside, the examination space was simple: a couch or low table on which the patient could recline, a window for light, shelves containing medical instruments, bronze probes and spatulas, folded linen for dressings, and jars of prepared medicines, poultices, decoctions, dried herbs. A patient who came with a complaint of disordered sleep would be questioned carefully. How long had the problem existed? Did they have trouble falling asleep, or trouble staying asleep, or trouble waking at the appropriate time? Did they wake in the night, and if so, at what hour? What were their dreams like, vivid and disturbing, or flat and without content, or absent entirely? Did they wake feeling rested or unrefreshed? These questions were not casual. They were part of a systematic inquiry designed to determine not just the symptom, but its origin. In what organ or system the imbalance lay, what had preceded the disruption, what the individual's particular constitution was, and how it made them more or less vulnerable to this specific kind of disturbance. The Hippocratic physicians believed in what they called the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each person had a characteristic predominance of one or two of these, which determined their temperament: sanguine, phlegmatic, choleric, melancholic, and their pattern of illness. This framework would later be criticized and eventually abandoned, but it had a practical value. It directed the physician to look at the whole person, not just the symptom. It insisted that the individual's particular nature mattered, that a treatment that worked for one person might not work for another, because the underlying constitution differed. A phlegmatic patient with sleep disturbances needed different management than a choleric one. A young person's disrupted sleep had different causes and different solutions than an elderly person's. This individualized approach to medicine has a great deal of resonance with the Chinese tradition's attention to personal chi patterns, and with the Indian tradition we will visit shortly. The ancient world's physicians, working from entirely different theoretical frameworks, kept arriving at the same practical conclusion: that the person in front of you was not a textbook case. They were a specific individual with a specific life and a specific body, and understanding that specificity was the beginning of helping them. Hippocrates was not the only Greek thinker with things to say about sleep. Aristotle, who lived from 384 to 322 BCE, and who managed in one lifetime to lay the foundational texts of biology, physics, logic, ethics, politics, aesthetics, and poetics, also wrote specifically about sleep. His treatise on sleep and sleeplessness is a short but dense text, part of a series of biological essays, and it represents something genuinely interesting: an attempt to explain sleep as a natural biological phenomenon using pure philosophical reasoning before the development of modern neuroscience working only from observation and logic. Aristotle's conclusion about why we sleep was this: sleep is a form of recovery from the work of waking. Specifically, he believed that the activity of the senses, seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, consumed a resource he called the vital heat. This vital heat was produced and managed by the heart, which was, in Aristotle's physiology, the central organ of sensation and consciousness. During waking activity, the vital heat was directed outward to the sensory organs to fuel their work. During digestion, which was another major consumer of vital heat, the warmth was directed inward to the stomach and gut. When the demands of digestion were strong enough, the vital heat was pulled so thoroughly inward that the sensory organs were effectively shut down. This was why Aristotle noted people tended to feel drowsy after eating. Sleep in his model was the systematic withdrawal of vital heat from the periphery, allowing the sensory organs and the brain, which he believed was a cooling organ, not the seat of consciousness, to rest while the body directed its resources toward digestion and recovery. This is wrong, we now know, in several of its details. The brain is not primarily a cooling organ. The heart is not the seat of consciousness. Sleep involves far more than the withdrawal of vital heat. But Aristotle's framework had a virtue that raw error sometimes possesses. It focused attention on the right questions even when the answers were incorrect. He was asking about the function of sleep, about why an organism that needed to stay alert to survive would regularly render itself helpless and unconscious, about what the body was doing during those hours of apparent inactivity. These questions turned out to be precisely the right ones. In Greek culture more broadly, the relationship with sleep was embedded in a rich mythological framework. Sleep had a god, Hypnos. His name is the root of our word hypnosis. He was depicted as a young man with wings at his temples, living in a dark cave through which the river Lethe, the river of forgetting, flowed, so that even the sound of the water was a kind of dissolving of memory and wakefulness. In some representations, he carried a horn from which he poured poppy juice or water from the Lethe over the eyes of those he was sending to sleep. Hypnos had a twin, Thanatos, the god of death. This pairing was not incidental. The Greeks were explicit about the family relationship between sleep and death. They shared a mother, Night, the goddess Nyx. They lived in the same realm and they bore a strong resemblance to each other in their effects. Sleep was the small death, the nightly loosening of the grip on consciousness. This could have made sleep frightening. In some ancient contexts it was, but the Greek philosophical tradition largely treated this parallel with equanimity. The Stoic philosophers in particular, though they came slightly later than Hippocrates and Aristotle, had a practice of meditating on death as a means of reducing the anxiety surrounding it, and sleep was part of this meditation. If you could rest quietly in the small death of sleep each night, willing and peaceful, you were practicing in a gentle and recoverable way the larger letting go that awaited you at the end. This is not a morbid thought in the Stoic framing. It is a deeply practical one. Sleep practiced with equanimity, with willingness, with a settled and unhurried acceptance. This sleep was a kind of training, a nightly lesson in the art of releasing what you held. The town of Epidaurus in the northeastern Peloponnese was home to one of the most important healing sanctuaries in the ancient world, the sanctuary of Asclepius, the god of medicine and healing, said to be the son of Apollo. The sanctuary at Epidaurus was a place of incubation, the same practice we saw in Egypt, but with its own Greek character. Patients who came here were often those for whom ordinary medicine had not worked. They came with chronic illnesses, with wounds that would not heal, with mysterious symptoms that no physician had been able to name. The process of incubation at Epidaurus was elaborate and carefully staged. Patients first underwent a period of purification, bathing, fasting, abstention from certain foods and from sex, observation of a ritual calendar. This period could last several days. Its purpose was partly religious, to make the patient worthy of approaching the god, but it also had practical effects on the body and mind. Fasting and abstention from stimulating foods calmed the digestive system and reduced the physical turbulence that interfered with clean, receptive sleep. Then, on the appointed night, the patient was led into the abaton, the sacred sleeping hall. This was a long, roofed colonnade, open on one side to the air of the sanctuary, with a series of sleeping couches or mats arranged along the inner wall. The air smelled of burning herbs and incense. Priests or temple servants moved quietly in the dim light. Hymns might be sung or spoken invocations, creating a specific acoustic atmosphere that today we would recognize as deeply conducive to relaxation. The patient lay down on their mat or couch, covered themselves with a light linen sheet, and waited. And in the night Asclepius was said to come, not always in an obvious dramatic apparition, though the votive inscriptions at Epidaurus contain accounts of precisely that. patients who dreamed of the god himself, a tall man with a staff and a serpent, who touched their wound or spoke a prescription into their ear. More often, perhaps, the experience was subtler. A dream whose imagery, when interpreted by the priests in the morning, seemed to point toward a treatment or a course of action. A night of unexpectedly deep and restful sleep after weeks of waking and turning, a sense of release, of something settling. The stone inscriptions that survive from Epidaurus record hundreds of these cases. They range from the miraculous sounding, a man blind in both eyes who dreamed that the god rubbed salve on his eyes and woke seeing, to the more clinically plausible, a woman with abdominal pain who was told in a dream to change her diet and was healed. A man with a leg injury who was instructed to rest it for a month. What we see in these records is not simply superstition. It is a sophisticated understanding achieved by other means of what we now call the healing power of rest. The deep, settled, protected sleep provided by the Abaton was itself therapeutic. The ritual preparation, fasting, purification, the psychological investment in the process, prepared the mind for something it could not do in its ordinary busy state. The healing that occurred at Epidaurus was real, even when the mechanism was not the one the Greeks believed it to be. One of Hippocrates' most famous successors, the physician Galen, who worked in Rome in the 2nd century CE but was Greek by birth and training, wrote extensively about sleep in a way that synthesized the Hippocratic tradition with centuries of additional observation. Galen was a meticulous clinician and a prolific writer. His surviving works fill over 20 volumes in modern editions, and his attention to sleep was characteristically thorough. He recommended specific sleeping postures for specific conditions. Patients with digestive problems should avoid sleeping on their backs, which he observed caused the stomach's contents to press against the diaphragm. Patients with heart palpitations should avoid the right side. Patients with headaches should sleep with the head only slightly elevated, not propped high. He recommended sleeping in a room with good air circulation. Fresh, clean air was, in his view, essential not just for waking health but for the quality of sleep itself. Stale air in a closed room interfered with the natural cooling of the brain during sleep and produced heavy, disturbed, unrefreshing sleep. He recommended that the room be dark, specifically noting that even small amounts of light reaching the sleeper through a window or under a door could prevent the full depth of sleep from occurring. He noted that certain sounds helped sleep, specifically continuous, rhythmic, unvarying sounds, as opposed to intermittent or startling ones. He observed that the sound of running water or a steady wind was conducive to sleep, while sudden noises, however small, were disruptive. He noted that the same medicine could produce sleep in one patient and wakefulness in another, depending on their constitution and the exact mechanism of their disturbance. He was, in short, paying very close attention. And 2,000 years later, in sleep science laboratories with polysomnography equipment and EEG monitors, we have confirmed a remarkable number of the things Galen described from empirical observation alone. There is a particular passage in Galen's writings that I want to linger with. He describes a patient, a middle-aged philosopher, a man of sedentary habits and busy intellectual life, who came to him unable to sleep. Not occasionally, not from time to time, but consistently. Night after night he lay in the dark and his mind refused to quiet. Thought succeeded thought. Problems he had set aside during the day returned with full intensity in the darkness. Galen's prescription was not herbs or potions. His prescription was this: the man needed to spend more time in his body. He had been living, Galen wrote, too exclusively in his mind. The ratio of intellectual activity to physical activity had become so unbalanced that the mental machinery had no natural point of fatigue at which it could stop. The body needed to tire the mind, in Galen's understanding, as much as the mind needed to tire the body. He recommended walking. Long, slow walks in the late afternoon, in good air, on a gentle slope rather than flat ground. The slight exertion of climbing, he thought, was particularly effective at promoting a healthy tiredness without overexerting the heart. He recommended the walks to be taken in silence, or in quiet, undemanding conversation, not in active intellectual discussion that would only extend the activity he was trying to quiet. He recommended that the philosopher stop reading and writing at least 2 hours before his intended sleeping time, and that he filled those 2 hours with something that used his hands rather than his mind. tending a garden, kneading dough if he could bear the kitchen work, slowly brushing and cleaning his own possessions. He recommended warm bathing before sleep. He recommended a small supper of easy-to-digest foods, bread, olives, a little honey. And he recommended that the philosopher, when he lay down in the dark, make a deliberate practice of noticing his body rather than his thoughts, to feel the weight of his limbs, to feel the coolness of the linen against his skin, to feel the movement of breath in his chest and belly, to inhabit for a few minutes the simple physical fact of being a body lying in the dark. The philosopher, Galen reports, slept well, the wisdom of the Vedas, and as the night deepens, we travel east again. Past the Persian mountains, past the Indus Valley and its ancient, still not fully deciphered cities, into the vast subcontinent of India, where one of the world's oldest living intellectual traditions was being assembled, century by century, into one of the most comprehensive systems of medical and philosophical thought that humanity has ever produced. We are entering the world of Ayurveda. Ayurveda, the word is Sanskrit, composed of Ayas, meaning life or lifespan, and Veda, meaning knowledge or wisdom, is often translated as the science of life or the knowledge of longevity. It is not a single text or a single theory, but an entire tradition of medical thinking, refined over centuries, encoded in a series of classical texts, the most important of which are the Charaka Samhita and the Sushruta Samhita, both probably reaching their current form somewhere between the 1st and 4th centuries CE, though drawing on earlier oral and written traditions. In the Ayurvedic system, health was not merely the absence of illness. It was a dynamic state of balance between three fundamental principles called doshas. The three doshas were Vata, Pitta, and Kapha. Vata was associated with movement, air, dryness, lightness, and irregularity. It governed all movement in the body, the movement of breath, of thoughts, of nerve impulses, of food through the gut. When Vata was in balance, a person was creative, quick-minded, enthusiastic. When Vata was elevated or disturbed, that person became scattered, anxious, irregular in their habits, prone to racing thoughts and dry skin and constipation, and significantly insomnia. Pitta was associated with fire, heat, sharpness, and transformation. It governed digestion, metabolism, the processing of food and experience alike. When Pitta was balanced, a person was focused, decisive, warm-natured, with good digestion and sharp intelligence. When Pitta was elevated, they became irritable, overly critical, prone to inflammation and heat-related disturbances. And their sleep, when it was disturbed, was often disturbed by vivid, intense, sometimes angry dreams. Kapha was associated with earth, water, heaviness, stability, and cohesion. It governed the body's structures, bones, muscles, fat, the lubricating fluids of the joints. When Kapha was balanced, a person was steady, calm, patient, with a strong immune system and deep, restoring sleep. When Kapha was excessive, that person became slow, heavy, congested, possibly depressed, and while they might sleep too much rather than too little, the sleep was often unrefreshing, characterized by a heavy grogginess on waking. Each person in Ayurvedic understanding had a characteristic constitution, a prakriti, that was their natural state of balance between these three principles. And health meant maintaining one's prakriti, while illness or distress represented a deviation from it, a vikriti which needed to be brought back into balance. Sleep in this system was deeply personal. A Vata-dominant person needed a very different approach to sleep than a Kapha-dominant person. What calmed one constitution might overstimulate another. What was restorative for one type might be too heavy for another. This individualized approach is, again, one of the recurring themes of ancient medical wisdom. The specific person in their specific constitution, in their specific season of life. Let us spend some time in the household of a prosperous family in ancient India, perhaps in the Gupta period around 300 to 500 CE, when Ayurvedic medicine was being systematically codified and was in wide practice across the subcontinent. The house is built around a central courtyard, as in China and Egypt. This is a remarkably common architectural feature of ancient civilization in warm climates, the courtyard that allows air circulation, that connects the private life of the family to the sky, that provides a sheltered outdoor space for the evening's activities. In the late afternoon, as the sun begins its descent and the heat of the day softens slightly, the family gathers in the courtyard. There is the smell of cooking from the kitchen, turmeric and cumin and mustard seeds in warm oil, the smell of rice steam and lentils. Children are called in from wherever they have been playing. The father returns from his work or his studies. The grandmother, who is the household's authority on all matters of daily practice and Ayurvedic routine, begins her evening supervision. In Ayurvedic tradition, the period from roughly sunset to full dark was called the sandhya, the twilight or junction time. And junction times were considered sacred and significant. They were times when one state of the world was transitioning to another, and that transition had its own energy, its own opportunities and risks. The evening sandhya was a time for winding down, for prayer or meditation, for the light evening meal, and for the preparation of the body and mind for sleep. The meal was eaten early, before or just after sunset when possible, and certainly well before the time of sleeping. In the Ayurvedic understanding, the digestive fire called agni was strongest at midday and weakest in the evening. So eating a heavy meal late in the day put inappropriate demands on a system that was naturally beginning to quiet. The evening meal was therefore the smallest of the day, a warm, easy-to-digest preparation, perhaps a thin dal, a small amount of rice or flat bread, a cup of warm spiced milk. Warm milk with spices was, and remains in the living Ayurvedic tradition, one of the most consistently recommended sleep aids. The specific preparation varied, sometimes just warm milk with a pinch of nutmeg, which was considered particularly useful for calming vata. Sometimes a more elaborate preparation called golden milk, with turmeric, black pepper, ginger and honey, which had anti-inflammatory properties that the ancient physicians did not describe in those terms but clearly observed empirically in their patients. The science behind warm milk-sleep association is now partially understood. Milk contains tryptophan, a precursor to serotonin and melatonin. The warmth relaxes the body. The ritual of the preparation itself signals to the nervous system that sleep is approaching. But the ancient physicians arrived at this practice not through biochemistry but through the much slower and in some ways more thorough process of generational observation. We gave people warm milk before sleep and they slept better. After the evening meal there was time for quiet activity, the kind that used the hands, not the sharp, concentrated faculty of the mind, gentle conversation, simple household tasks. The telling of stories to children, which served the double purpose of entertaining them and of unwinding the adult mind from the day's tensions by moving into the narrative world. In some households there was music, a family member playing a simple instrument, a veena or a flute, or singing in a low, unhurried voice. The ancient Indian musical tradition had specific ragas, melodic frameworks, associated with specific times of day. The ragas appropriate for the late evening were distinctly different in their character from those of midday or early morning. Slower, more meditative, built on intervals and ornaments that the tradition considered intrinsically calming. The evening raga was not background music. It was a sonic environment specifically designed for the time of day, in the same way that incense and low light were environmental preparations. The Charaka Samhita, the older and more medically focused of the two great Ayurvedic texts, gives specific guidance on sleep timing. It states that the ideal time for sleep is at the end of the first third of the night. In practical terms, roughly 2 to 3 hours after sunset, which in most of India would put sleep onset between 8 and 10 in the evening, depending on season. This early sleeping time was related to a specific understanding of what happened in the body at different hours of the night. The first part of the night, kapha time in Ayurvedic chronobiology, was associated with the earthly, heavy, stable dosha. Sleep initiated during this period would naturally be deep and restorative, grounded in the stable qualities of kapha. Sleep that began in the later hours, when pitta time, associated with heat and activity, or vata time, associated with movement and instability, dominated, would be lighter, more easily disturbed and less nourishing. This is, in modern terms, a description of what sleep scientists call sleep architecture, the pattern of deep sleep, slow wave sleep, and lighter sleep REM and lighter NREM stages through the night. Deep, restorative slow wave sleep is indeed concentrated in the earlier parts of the night. Delaying sleep onset shifts this architecture, reducing the proportion of deep sleep and increasing lighter stages. The Ayurvedic physicians, without polysomnography or laboratory analysis, had observed this pattern across centuries of clinical practice and encoded it in their chronobiological framework. The sleeping room in an Ayurvedic household was oriented carefully. Ancient Indian texts on architecture, the Vastu Shastra, which governed the placement and orientation of buildings and rooms, specified that the sleeping position of the head was significant. Sleeping with the head pointing south was recommended for most people. The south was associated with Yama, the god of death, and sleeping toward him was considered a form of peaceful acceptance. More practically, it was also the direction of the Earth's magnetic field in the northern hemisphere, and some modern researchers have speculated that geomagnetic alignment may have subtle effects on sleep quality, though this remains an area of active research rather than settled science. Sleeping with the head to the east was acceptable and associated with spiritual merit, the east being the direction of the rising sun and therefore of spiritual illumination. Sleeping to the west was less recommended. Sleeping with the head to the north was actively cautioned against, as this placed the head in opposition to the Earth's magnetic north and was considered energetically disruptive. Whether or not you accept the metaphysical reasoning, the prescription itself, attend to the orientation of your sleeping body in your room, reflects a larger principle that runs through all these ancient sleep traditions. The sleeping space was not accidental. It was arranged with intention. Every element of it was considered. The bed was placed not wherever it happened to fit in the room, but where it created the right conditions. The bedding was chosen for the season, lighter in summer, heavier in winter, with attention to the specific dosha characteristics of the sleeper. The window position was considered, enough air circulation for freshness, not so much that the sleeper was chilled by drafts, which were considered particularly disturbing to Vata constitution. This attention to environment as a factor in sleep quality, this understanding that where you sleep matters as much as when and how, is one of the most consistent themes across all the traditions we have visited and will visit. The body is sensitive to its surroundings during sleep in a way that it is not quite during waking, when the conscious attention can override environmental signals. The sleeping body cannot consciously override anything. It responds to temperature and air quality and sound and light directly, without the mediation of will. The ancient physicians knew this, even without knowing why. Beyond medicine, the ancient Indian philosophical traditions had their own profound accounts of sleep. The Upanishads, the philosophical texts that form the culmination of the Vedic tradition, most of them composed between roughly 800 and 200 BCE, contain some of the most remarkable writing about sleep and consciousness to be found anywhere in the ancient world. The Mandakya Upanishad is a very short text, 12 verses, less than a single page, but it contains an analysis of consciousness that has been described as one of the most sophisticated in ancient philosophy. The text proposes that consciousness has 4 states, not 2. The first state is waking Jagrat, the everyday state of ordinary sensory experience, engagement with the world through the 5 senses and the thinking mind. The second state is dreaming Svapna, the internal state in which the mind creates its own world from the residue of experience, a world as vivid and real as waking experience but generated entirely from within. The third state is deep dreamless sleep, Sashapti. And this is where the Mandakya Upanishad becomes philosophically interesting. Sashapti is not merely unconsciousness in the modern sense. It is not simply the absence of experience. It is in the Upanishadic analysis a state of pure undifferentiated awareness, what the text calls a mass of cognition, a state without objects, without subject-object distinction, without the divisions and separations that characterize waking and dreaming experience. In Sashapti, the practitioner was understood to be in temporary unconscious contact with Brahman, the ultimate ground of reality, the one undivided consciousness from which all experience arises and to which it returns. This is why deep sleep in the Indian tradition was not just restorative but spiritually significant. Waking up from deep, dreamless sleep and feeling genuinely refreshed, that refreshed quality was not merely a matter of brain chemistry. It was the effect of having been close, however briefly and without awareness, to the source of consciousness itself. The great teacher Adi Shankaracharya, working in the 8th century CE and commenting on the Mandakya Upanishad, described deep sleep as a small and temporary experience of liberation, of moksha, the ultimate goal of the Indian spiritual traditions. In deep sleep, the boundaries of individual self temporarily dissolved. The sense of being a separate person with a separate history and a separate set of problems momentarily ceased. And then you woke up and it all came back. But the refreshment you felt, the sense of having been returned to something, of having been for a few hours released from the weight of being yourself, that was real. And understanding this in the Upanishadic framework was part of spiritual education. Learning to go to sleep not as a collapse into unconsciousness, but as a willing, temporary dissolution into the larger ground of being. The fourth state in the Mandakya Upanishad is Turiya, which means simply the fourth. It is not a separate state like the others, but rather the witnessing awareness that underlies and pervades all three other states. The pure consciousness that is present during waking, dreaming, and deep sleep alike, unchanged by the content of any of them. We don't need to follow the metaphysics all the way to appreciate the practical implication. The implication is that sleep is not a gap in consciousness. It is not the absence of experience. It is another mode of experience, one with its own quality and value, one that in its deepest form offers something that waking life cannot. The Indian sages who thought this through were not making a poetic gesture. They were in their own language and framework describing something they had directly observed, that the quality of deep sleep was not arbitrary, that it was possible to relate to sleep with more awareness, more intentionality, and that doing so changed something about the experience of waking. There is a practice mentioned in several classical Indian texts and still taught in the living traditions of yoga and meditation called Yoga Nidra, sometimes translated as yogic sleep or the sleep of yoga. In Yoga Nidra, the practitioner lies down in complete stillness, usually in the posture called Shavasana, the corpse pose, flat on the back with limbs slightly apart and everything released, and is guided through a systematic rotation of awareness through the body, followed by a movement through the states of consciousness, deliberately touching the threshold between waking and sleeping, learning to remain aware at that threshold rather than falling fully into sleep. The goal is not to fall asleep. The goal is to reach the state just before sleep, the hypnagogic state as we now call it, and to rest there awake and aware in the borderland between waking and dreaming. This state, the ancient practitioners reported, was unusually restorative. Even a relatively short period, 20 minutes to an hour spent in this threshold state, left the practitioner feeling more rested than a much longer period of ordinary sleep. Modern sleep researchers have found evidence supporting this. The hypnagogic state is associated with specific brainwave patterns, theta waves, that are also associated with deep relaxation, creative insight, and the consolidation of memory. Spending deliberate time in this state may indeed have some of the restorative properties attributed to it. But for our purposes this evening, what matters most is simply the attention. The care with which the ancient Indian tradition approached not just the act of sleeping, but the process of transition into sleep. The threshold was not a gap to be crossed quickly. It was a territory to be entered slowly, with awareness, with respect. The Charaka Samhita also contains something that reads almost like a prescription for a complete bedtime routine. It was called the nisha-charya, the conduct of the night, and it laid out in some detail the sequence of activities and practices considered ideal for the evening hours. The nisha-charya began at or just after sunset. First, the evening bath or washing. Not necessarily a full bath, the full bath was a morning practice, but at minimum the washing of the feet, which were considered the body's primary point of contact with the earth, and therefore the primary portal through which the day's accumulated energies entered. Washing the feet before sleep was both hygienic and symbolic. It cleansed the contact point, prepared the boundary. Then the evening meal, light and warm, eaten in quiet company or alone, without the distraction of difficult conversation or stimulating topics. Then a period of quiet walking, perhaps in the courtyard or garden, or light household activity. The body needed time to complete the digestive process before lying down. Then light reading if the person was literate and inclined that way, specifically texts that were calming and uplifting rather than stimulating. Sacred poetry, philosophical texts, stories of virtuous figures. Not legal documents, not administrative matters, not anything requiring sharp concentration or emotional engagement. Then, the application of oil to the body. Abhyanga, self-massage with warm sesame oil or coconut oil, or a medicated oil appropriate to the person's dosha, was recommended as a daily practice in the Ayurvedic tradition, and doing it in the evening before sleep was considered particularly effective for calming the nervous system and promoting deep sleep. The gentle pressure and warmth of the massage, combined with the properties of the oil itself, sesame oil was considered particularly vata pacifying, which is to say, calming to the principle associated with anxiety and restlessness, created a profound settling of the body that the ancient physicians consistently observed to improve sleep quality. Then, a small cup of warm milk with spices. Then a brief period of prayer or meditation, sitting quietly, breathing slowly, offering the day to whatever higher power or principle one acknowledged. Then sleep. The whole sequence from the evening bath to lying down would have taken approximately 2 to 3 hours. It was not a rushed preparation. It was a genuine transition given the time and attention it deserved. It treated the approach of sleep not as a collapse or a convenience, but as an arrival, something you prepared for, moved toward, received. The Roman night, and as the night deepens further, we find ourselves in another world entirely. Noisier, more crowded, more self-consciously sophisticated and more brutally practical in equal measure, ancient Rome. Rome in the 1st century CE, the height of the imperial period, when the city had a population of perhaps 1 million people, when aqueducts carried clean water from distant mountains into the streets, when the Forum was a place of daily commerce and political spectacle, when the baths and the basilicas and the temples pressed up against each other in the narrow, sun-baked streets of one of the most densely inhabited urban environments in the ancient world, Rome did not sleep quietly. The city at night was loud. Ancient sources describe it clearly and with considerable complaint. The streets of Rome were kept free of wheeled traffic during the day to prevent congestion, which meant that all deliveries, all cart traffic, all the grunt work of supplying a city of 1 million people happened at night. The wooden wheels of heavy carts on stone-paved streets, the shouts of drivers, the braying of mules, the crash and clatter of goods being unloaded. The drunken shouting from a tavern on the next street, the arguments, the music, the dogs. The Roman poet Juvenal, writing in the early 2nd century CE, complained bitterly about the impossibility of sleeping in the city. The noise, the danger of falling objects from upper-floor windows, the constant press and movement of a city that never fully stopped, all of this, he wrote, was driving him mad. This is interesting in our context because it tells us something about where sleep wisdom was most urgently needed in ancient Rome. Not in the countryside, where the natural rhythms of light and dark provided their own structure, but in the city where those rhythms were constantly disrupted by the demands and pleasures of urban life. The Roman approach to sleep, or at least the approach of the literate upper classes whose writings have survived, was shaped significantly by 2 philosophical traditions. The first was Epicurean philosophy, which held that the good life consisted of simple pleasures carefully cultivated, the avoidance of unnecessary pain and anxiety, and the cultivation of equanimity, a settled and undisturbed state of mind that the Epicureans called ataraxia. For the Epicureans, sleep was one of the simplest and most accessible of pleasures. Epicurus himself, in his letters, praised the pleasures of sleeping and eating as among the most fundamental and underrated of human experiences. Not the elaborate pleasures of wealth and banquets, but the basic animal satisfaction of a good night's sleep in a comfortable bed, well fed, free from pain, with nothing threatening you in the immediate future. This sounds modest. In the context of 1st century Rome, a city full of political anxiety, personal danger, financial precariousness, and the constant social performance required of those who wish to maintain their standing, cultivating the ability to simply lie down and sleep peacefully was a significant achievement. It required a specific kind of inner work, the reduction of the restlessness and anxiety that prevented it. The second tradition was Stoicism, which in Rome found some of its greatest practitioners and writers. Seneca the Elder and his son Lucius Annaeus Seneca, the philosopher and playwright, Epictetus, the former slave who became one of the most influential teachers in the Roman world, and Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor who ruled Rome from 161 to 100 AD CE and wrote his private philosophical reflections in a journal we know as the Meditations. For the Stoics, sleep was not primarily about pleasure. It was about resilience. Seneca, Lucius Annaeus Seneca, the younger, advisor to the Emperor Nero, and one of the most widely read philosophers of the ancient world, who wrote about sleep in his letters with a directness and a self-awareness that feels remarkably contemporary. In his letters to Lucilius, a collection of personal letters addressed to a friend that became effectively a philosophical treatise in epistolary form, Seneca described his own sleep habits with characteristic candor. He was not a naturally easy sleeper. He acknowledged this. He had periods of insomnia, particularly in his later years, and he reflected on what they told him about his own mind. What kept him awake, he found, was almost always the same thing: attachment to outcomes he could not control. The political situation, always precarious for a man of his prominence and proximity to imperial power, his health, the reception of his work, the state of his friendships, all of these, when he brought them to bed with him, became sources of the very agitation that prevented rest. The Stoic framework provided him with a consistent response to this problem. The first principle of Stoic philosophy, the foundational insight from which nearly everything else follows, is the distinction between what is up to us and what is not. What is within our power, our judgments, our intentions, our responses to events, and what is outside our power, everything else, including other people's behavior, the course of political events, the state of our health, the length of our lives. Suffering in the Stoic view came from confusing these two categories, from treating things that were not within our control as if they were and straining against their resistance, or from treating things within our control, particularly our own minds, our own choices about how to respond to circumstances, as if they were not. Applied to sleep, this principle had a specific and practical form. You cannot control whether you sleep. Sleep is not within the power of your will in the direct way that lifting your arm is. You can create conditions favorable to it. You can do everything that wisdom and experience recommend, and then it is not up to you. The attempt to force sleep through will, through anxiety, through the desperate insistence that you must sleep, that you need to sleep, that it is terrible that you are not sleeping. This attempt was, in the Stoic view, not just ineffective but actively counterproductive. It was the application of energy and engagement to something that required their release. The Stoic prescription was, do what is within your power, then accept what follows. What was within your power was the preparation, the quiet evening, the moderate meal, the philosophical reading, the reduction of the day's unfinished business before lying down. What was not within your power was the sleep itself. And lying in the dark, having done what could be done, the Stoic would practice what they called amor fati, love of fate, applied even to this small and intimate circumstance. If sleep came, good. If it did not come, the night was still not wasted. It was an opportunity to observe the mind, to practice equanimity in the face of frustration, to remain peaceful in circumstances that were not ideal. Seneca wrote with characteristic bluntness, "The wise man lives as long as he ought, not merely as long as he can." He might have added, and he sleeps as deeply as circumstances allow, and is at peace with what circumstances do not allow. Marcus Aurelius is perhaps the most interesting figure in this tradition, because we have his private reflections, the Meditations, written only for himself, never intended for publication, in which we see the Stoic philosophy being practiced in real time with all the difficulty and imperfection that practice involves. Marcus was an emperor. His days were full of decisions, campaigns, political negotiations, judicial hearings, the management of an empire stretched across 3 continents. He was also chronically unwell. Modern scholars have speculated about various conditions, though nothing is certain, and he experienced periods of significant physical discomfort and fatigue. He wrote about the difficulty of waking in the morning with a frankness that is almost charming. There is a passage in the Meditations where he imagines himself lying in bed, reasoning with himself about why he should get up. He acknowledges the pull of the warm bed, the temptation to stay, the rationalizations his mind produces, and he argues himself up with Stoic logic. You are made to do work. The hive does not run on the principle of the bee staying warm. But this is about waking, not sleeping. About sleep, what Marcus shows us is something different. In his meditations, he regularly notes, in the specific context of preparing for and enduring a difficult day, the practice of drawing on what rest was available, whatever its quality, not lamenting that he did not sleep enough, not carrying the previous night's poor sleep as a burden into the day, taking what was given. There is a specific Stoic practice described in some detail in Epictetus, Marcus's philosophical predecessor and the philosopher whose Enchiridion Marcus is known to have kept close, called the premeditation of misfortune, the premeditatio malorum. Before sleep, the practitioner would briefly and calmly imagine the difficulties that might arise tomorrow or in the future, the bad news, the frustration, the disappointment. Not dwelling on them or feeding anxiety about them, but simply acknowledging their possibility so that they could not arrive as shocks. This practice is the philosophical opposite of the anxiety spiral that modern people often experience at night, the catastrophizing, the circular worry, the imagining of worst cases in ways that become more vivid and terrible the longer they are contemplated. The Stoic premeditation was brief, calm, and deliberately deflationary. 5 minutes, not an hour. An acknowledgement of possibility, not an anticipation of certainty. After the brief reflection, the mind was invited to return to the present, to the warmth of the bed, to the simple fact of being alive and reasonably well for another night, and then sleep if it came. The Roman baths, the thermae, which were among the most remarkable public buildings in the ancient world, were not just hygiene facilities or social clubs, though they were certainly both. They were also health facilities, and Roman physicians regularly prescribed specific bathing regimes for patients with various conditions, including sleep disturbances. A typical prescription might be a warm bath of moderate heat in the late afternoon, followed by a cool rinse, followed by a slow walk home, followed by a light meal. The sequence was designed to take advantage of the body's thermoregulatory response to bathing. During the warm bath, blood vessels in the skin dilated and body temperature rose. After leaving the warm water, heat radiated from the skin and core body temperature dropped, and this drop in core temperature was a powerful physiological signal for the onset of sleep. The Roman physicians did not know the neuroscience of this process. They knew from observation that it worked. For the Roman military, the legions that maintained the empire across thousands of miles of frontier, sleep was a matter of survival. A Roman legion on campaign was a precision instrument of war, and that instrument required rest to function. The Roman military mind approached this with the same systematic pragmatism it brought to siege engineering and road building. The castra, the Roman military camp, was built on a standard plan regardless of location, so that any soldier could find his way in the dark. The tents were arranged in regular rows. Watch duties were rotated so that every soldier had a guaranteed period of uninterrupted sleep. The night was divided into 4 watches of roughly 3 hours each, and the trumpet signal for the changing of the watch was a sound every Roman soldier knew as well as his own name. The military doctors, medici, were attentive to the sleep of soldiers in a way that reflected the practical understanding that a sleep-deprived army was an army prone to error. Before major engagements, the legions were deliberately given additional rest. After long forced marches, the castra was established earlier than usual to allow recovery. The Stoic tradition was particularly well suited to military life precisely because it addressed the problem of sleeping in adverse conditions. A Stoic soldier could lie on cold ground in a leaky tent, with the sounds of an enemy camp audible in the dark, and still find sleep, not because he was unusually comfortable, but because he had trained his mind to separate the necessity of sleep from the conditions it arrived in. Sleep in the Stoic military tradition was not a comfort to be waited for until conditions were favorable. It was a duty to be executed like any other, in whatever conditions were available. The Roman poet Virgil, writing in the 1st century BCE during the reign of Augustus, gave us one of the most beautiful single images of sleep in the classical tradition. In the Aeneid, his great epic of the founding of Rome, there is a passage in Book IV where night falls across the Mediterranean world, and Virgil describes what that night brings. He writes of a world at rest. The The birds stilled on the water, the wild animals settled in the fields, the stars moving slowly through their courses overhead, the sea laying quiet at the shores, everything resting, everything at peace. This image of universal sleep, the whole of nature resting together in one great communal act of laying down the work of the day, was not merely poetic decoration for Virgil. It was a reminder of the human being's place in the larger order, that to sleep well was to participate in a pattern that included everything, that reached from the smallest mouse in its burrow to the vast movement of the stars. That to rest was natural, that to rest was right, that the night, held gently and without resistance, was among the most generous gifts available to a creature who lived. The Hebrew tradition and the Talmudic mind, and as the night deepens, we travel to another part of the ancient world, to the narrow limestone hills and wide valleys of ancient Canaan, to the warm sea to the west and the desert to the east, to the city of Jerusalem with its white stone walls and its temple smoke, and to the quiet rooms where scholars bent over their lamps and wrote by night, because the day was too full of the world's demands and the night was the only time they had. In the ancient Hebrew tradition, and later in the Talmudic tradition of the rabbinical scholars who succeeded the biblical period, sleep was neither a physiological event to be analyzed nor a spiritual journey to be cultivated. It was something more intimate than either. It was a conversation with God. The Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, contains dozens of references to sleep, ranging from the practical to the theological to the profoundly poetic. One of the most quoted is from the Psalms, specifically Psalm 127, attributed to Solomon, that God grants sleep to those he loves. This is sometimes translated as he gives sleep to his beloved or he gives rest to his beloved, and the nuance matters. Sleep in this framing is not something the individual achieves or earns or manages. It is a gift, something granted, something received. This passive, receptive understanding of sleep as something that happens to you, not something you do, appears across many ancient traditions, as we have seen. But in the Hebrew biblical tradition, the recipient of the gift is specifically a beloved, someone in relationship. Sleep, in this sense, is an act of divine intimacy, the Creator placing the beloved into rest as a parent places a child into sleep. The image has an extraordinary gentleness to it. The Hebrew prayer tradition developed over the centuries a specific structure for the transition into sleep. The Shema, one of the central declarations of Jewish faith from Deuteronomy 6:4, a declaration of divine unity, was traditionally recited in 2 daily prayer services, morning and evening. But there was also a bedtime version, called the Kriyat Shema al-Hamita, the recitation of the Shema upon the bed, which was a specific practice of saying the Shema at the moment of lying down to sleep. This practice, described in the Babylonian Talmud in the tractate Birakat, which deals specifically with blessings and prayers and their proper times and forms, came with a series of accompanying prayers and blessings that formed a complete bedtime liturgy. The prayers asked for protection through the night, for the angels Michael, Gabriel, Uriel, and Raphael to stand at the 4 sides of the sleeper, and for the divine presence, the Shekinah, to rest above. They expressed gratitude for the day, acknowledgement of human fragility, and trust in divine care. There was also a prayer specifically about the soul, words drawn from the Psalms about committing the spirit into God's hands, the idea that at the moment of sleep, the soul was temporarily entrusted to God, as a merchant might entrust his goods to a trusted keeper for the night, expecting to receive them back in the morning. This prayer, with minor variations, became the basis for one of the most widely known prayers in the Christian tradition as well, demonstrating the degree to which this particular understanding of sleep, as a temporary and trusting surrender of the self into divine care, resonated across cultural and theological boundaries. The Talmud, the vast compendium of rabbinic discussion, law, narrative, and wisdom compiled between roughly the 3rd and 6th centuries CE, contains a remarkable amount of material about sleep. Some of it is purely practical, discussions of when it is permissible to sleep on Shabbat, what sleeping positions are appropriate for different people and circumstances, how much sleep a person needs. The rabbis were detailed and often surprisingly empirical in their approach to these questions. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, a 3rd century sage, is quoted as saying that sleep is 1/60th of death. This fraction appears frequently in Talmudic literature as a way of expressing the relationship between two things that share a quality without being identical. Sleep is not death, but it participates in the same stillness, the same release of ordinary consciousness, the same temporary absence of the waking self. The rabbis debated the minimum amount of sleep required for health and for the proper performance of religious duties. Specifically, the question of whether a scholar who had studied through the night was required to sleep before morning prayers, or whether prayer could be performed in a state of exhausted wakefulness. The consensus that emerged reflected a practical wisdom. The body required rest, and a person who denied their body its necessary rest was not being more devout but was undermining the very capacity for devotion. You could not pray well from a place of complete exhaustion. You could not study well. You could not love well. The body's needs were not obstacles to the spiritual life, they were its ground. There is a figure in the Talmudic tradition, less a single historical person and more a recurring type, the archetype of the scholar-sage, whose relationship with sleep illuminates something essential about this tradition's values. The yeshiva baker, the young Talmudic student, typically living in the house of his teacher or in a study house, dedicating his days and much of his nights to the study of Torah, occupied a specific position in the ancient and medieval Jewish world. He was both honored and pitied, honored for the holiness of his pursuit, pitied for the physical demands it placed on him. The study of Torah was, in the rabbinic tradition, itself a form of prayer, a form of devotion. The scholar who studied through the night was doing something genuinely sacred, but the tradition was also clear that this sacred pursuit could not be maintained indefinitely without rest. The great scholars of the Talmudic period were, by the accounts that have survived, people of extraordinary physical discipline, but they slept. Maimonides, the great medieval Jewish philosopher and physician who drew deeply on the Talmudic tradition and on Aristotle and on the Arabic medical tradition of his day, wrote in his Mishneh Torah, compiled in the 12th century CE but drawing on much older sources, that sleep was necessary, that the proper amount was 8 hours, that one should sleep on one side, and that sleeping immediately after eating was harmful. This is practical medical advice from a rabbi and physician, but it is embedded in a theological framework. Caring for the body was, in the Jewish tradition, a religious obligation. The body was not the enemy of the soul. It was the soul's instrument and dwelling place, and to damage it through neglect was a form of impiety. There is one more element of the ancient Hebrew sleep tradition worth spending time with. The Psalms, the 150 poetic and musical texts that form part of the Hebrew Bible and became central to both Jewish and Christian worship, contain some of the most beautiful writing about the experience of night, of waking in the dark, of lying in bed with a troubled mind that exists in the ancient world. Psalm 4 speaks of lying down and sleeping in peace, finding safety in divine care. Psalm 16 speaks of the heart that offers instruction even in the night, the inner voice that continues its quiet work while the mind rests. And Psalm 77 begins with one of the most honest accounts of nighttime restlessness in ancient literature. The psalmist describes crying out in distress, stretched out in the dark, unable to be comforted. This last psalm, it goes on to describe the psalmist lying awake, unable to pray, turning over memories and losses and fears in the dark, is not a failure of faith in the Hebrew understanding. It is a form of prayer. The stretching out of hands in the dark is itself an act of relationship with God. The very restlessness is a kind of reaching. The night in the Psalms is a space of intimacy, not the comfortable intimacy of a calm evening, but sometimes the difficult intimacy of a wrestling match, of crying out in the dark to something that does not immediately answer. What the Psalms offer to the person lying awake at 2 in the morning is not a solution. They offer something more valuable, company, testimony that someone else was here before you, lying in the dark, awake, turning over the same questions. That this experience is not a malfunction, but a feature of human consciousness and human relationship with the transcendent. That the night held them too. Sufis and the mystic night, and as the night reaches its deepest hour, we arrive in another world. one that grew up partly from the Hebrew and Greek traditions we have already visited, and partly from something entirely its own. The Islamic world of the 8th through 13th centuries CE, the period known as the Golden Age, was, among many other things, a period of extraordinary medical and philosophical achievement. In the cities of Baghdad, Cairo, Cordoba, and Samarkand, scholars translated and extended the Greek medical tradition, combined it with Indian Ayurvedic knowledge brought along the trade routes, and added to it their own original observations and insights. The physician Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, was born in 980 CE in what is now Uzbekistan and died in 1037 CE. His canon of medicine, the Canon Fayal-Tib, was one of the most comprehensive medical encyclopedias ever written, and it remained the standard medical textbook in European universities until the 17th century. Ibn Sina wrote about sleep with a depth and systematicity that surpassed even Galen. He addressed its causes and functions, its disturbances and remedies, its ideal duration and timing, and the significance of dreams as both diagnostic and spiritual data. He believed, following Aristotle and Galen but extending their reasoning, that sleep occurred when vapors arising from digestion rose to the brain and produced a temporary cooling and clouding of the sensory faculties. As the night progressed and digestion continued, these vapors dissipated, the brain gradually re-warmed, and waking occurred naturally. He recommended sleeping on the right side in the early part of the night to facilitate digestion, then shifting to the left side in the middle of the night, and then to the right again toward morning. This sequence was designed to take advantage of the natural progression of digestion. Lying on the right allowed the stomach to empty more easily in the early hours. Lying on the left later shifted the pressure to aid in the final stages of processing. He noted that extremes of temperature interfered with sleep. Rooms that were too hot kept the brain too active, while rooms that were too cold caused the body to contract defensively rather than relax. He described the psychological contributors to insomnia with remarkable precision. Grief, anxiety, obsessive thoughts, excessive joy, which kept the mind too active and stimulated, and fear all disturbed sleep by maintaining a degree of sensory and mental arousal incompatible with the natural withdrawal required for sleep. His remedies for insomnia were both physical and psychological, medicinal preparations alongside philosophical guidance, sensory calming alongside mental reorientation. But Ibn Sina was also, as almost all of the great Islamic scholars of this period were, a man of deep spiritual life, and the spiritual tradition within which he worked, specifically the Sufi dimension of Islamic mysticism that ran parallel to and intertwined with the more legalistic and academic traditions, had its own remarkable understanding of the night. In the Sufi tradition, the night was not simply a time for sleep. It was a time for what was called tahajjud, the voluntary night prayer performed after waking from an initial sleep, typically between midnight and the hours before dawn. The Quran makes reference to this practice. There are verses specifically commending the practice of rising in the night to pray, describing it as a time when the heart is most open, the self most stripped of its daily defenses, the communication between the human and the divine most direct. Sufi teachers elaborated this into an entire theology of the night. The great Persian poet and teacher Rumi, Jalal ad-Din Muhammad Rumi, who lived from 1207 to 1273 CE, and whose Masnavi and Divan are among the greatest bodies of mystical poetry ever written, spoke and wrote about the night constantly. For Rumi, the darkness of the night was not an obstacle or an absence, it was a presence. The specific presence of the soul stripped of its daytime camouflage, naked before the reality of its own longing. He described the night prayer not as an obligation but as a homecoming. He described lying awake in the dark as an opportunity, not a problem to be solved, but an invitation to the kind of attention that the busy day never allowed. He wrote of the lover who could not sleep because the heart was too full, not too troubled. The one who lay awake listening to something the waking, distracted mind could never hear, a sound beneath sounds, a presence beneath presences. There is a particular practice described in Sufi literature that I want to linger with as we approach the end of our journey. It was called muraqabah, contemplative awareness or watchfulness, a practice of sitting or lying in a state of quiet, alert attention, not directed at any particular object or thought, but simply present, aware of awareness itself. This practice, done before sleep, was understood in the Sufi tradition as a way of preparing the heart for whatever the night might bring, including the possibility of divine communication through dreams, but more fundamentally, the nightly experience of the soul's natural state, still, open, receptive, turned toward its source. The great Sufi teacher Ibn Arabi, born in Mercia in 1165 CE, died in Damascus in 1240 CE, and widely considered one of the most original and comprehensive thinkers in the Islamic mystical tradition, wrote extensively about dreams and sleep in his vast work of spiritual philosophy. For Ibn Arabi, the sleeping state was a barzakh, a threshold, an isthmus between two worlds. In sleep, the soul crossed into a realm where ordinary categories of time and space no longer applied in the same way, where communication from divine and spiritual sources was possible in ways that the waking mind's rational defenses prevented. He described the act of falling asleep as a kind of death, not the permanent death of the body, but the temporary death of the ego, the small self's hold on consciousness. And this death was not to be feared, it was to be welcomed. It was a practice in the art of release that would one day culminate in the final release. The Sufi mystic, lying down in the night, was practicing dying, and in that practice they were learning something about what it meant to live, the thread that runs through the night. And now, as the night has reached its fullest depth, let us rest here for a moment. We have traveled far tonight. We have sat with a Chinese scholar in his dark room, while the qi moved inward through channels we cannot see but can somehow still understand. We have lain in the incubation chamber of an Egyptian temple while the painted eyes of Hathor watched from the wall and the smell of kaifi rose and turned slowly in the still air. We have sat in the consulting room of Hippocrates and listened to his careful questions and received his equally careful prescription. Walk, eat moderately, breathe, attend to the body you live. We have followed the evening routine of an Indian household as the grandmother supervised the winding down of the day, the spiced milk, the oil on the skin, the brief prayer, the early and deliberate approach to sleep. We have heard Seneca in the Roman night practicing his Stoic equanimity, releasing what could not be held, making peace with the sleep that would come or would not come on its own terms. We have recited the Shema in the dark, those ancient Hebrew words that placed the sleeper in the care of something larger than themselves. And we have sat in the Sufi night in the deep and watchful silence of Muraqabah, learning to be present at the threshold between waking and whatever waits beyond it. What is the thread that runs through all of these? It is attention. Every one of these traditions, so different in their cosmologies, their metaphysics, their specific prescriptions, shared one fundamental understanding: that sleep deserved to be taken seriously, that the approach to sleep was as important as sleep itself, that the evening was not dead time, not a waiting room before unconsciousness, but a genuine and significant part of the day that required care, intention, and a specific quality of mind. The Chinese physicians attended to the timing and direction of the body's vital energy. The Egyptian priests created sacred environments, rituals of protection, spaces of invitation. The Greek physicians observed and reasoned and recommended the practical support of the body's natural processes. The Indian sages developed complete evening routines designed to gradually withdraw the mind and body from the world's demands and turn them gently toward rest. The Roman Stoics practiced the art of releasing what could not be held. The Hebrew tradition offered the comfort of relationship with something that would watch while you slept. The Sufi mystics turned the darkness itself into a practice of presence. None of them said, just lie down and close your eyes. All of them said, in one way or another, the night requires something of you first, not effort, not achievement, but intention, attention. A willingness to approach the threshold of sleep the way you would approach something sacred, with care, with gratitude, with the willingness to let go. Tonight, wherever you are part of a very long history. The scholar in his dark room in Han Dynasty China, the woman on her reed mat in the Egyptian temple, the philosopher lying still in a Roman apartment while the city clattered and shouted on the street below, the yeshiva student setting aside his manuscript. The Sufi practitioner in the hour before dawn sitting with the profound and patient darkness. All of them arrived at this same threshold, All of them carried the weight of their particular day, its worries and its satisfactions, its unfinished conversations and its small completed tasks, its moments of beauty and its moments of difficulty. And all of them eventually let it go, not because they solved it, not because they finished it, but because the night was deeper than any single day's concerns, and the body knew this, and the wisdom of thousands of years of human experience knew this. And at some point the mind became quiet enough to remember what the body already knew. That sleep was not a problem to be solved. It was a return. Let your breathing slow now. If you have been following this journey with the kind of attention that makes time pass quickly, you may already feel that settling, the particular quality of a mind that has been moving through a long and gentle story and is now arriving at its natural stopping place. Your body is heavy in a comfortable way. The room around you is quiet or quieter than it was. The day is finished as much as it can be finished. The rest will wait. The ancient Chinese physician would say the qi is turning inward. Let it go. The Egyptian priest would say you are in the care of something larger. Rest. Hippocrates would say you have done what is within your power, accept what follows. The Ayurvedic teacher would say kapha time is here, the earth is supporting you, let yourself be heavy. Seneca would say release what is not yours to hold tonight, tomorrow will carry its own work. The psalmist would say I will lie down and sleep in peace. Rumi would say the night is not empty, it is full of the presence you have been seeking all day. And so, here you are in the old and reliable dark, in the company of everyone who has ever lain awake and everyone who has ever found their way to sleep and everyone who has ever been grateful for the morning that followed a long and restful night. The stars, wherever they are above you, are moving very slowly in their courses. The world is breathing. Everything that needed to happen today happened, and what didn't happen will still be there tomorrow, patient as stone, unhurried as the river. You don't need to do anything now. You don't need to think anything. You don't need to solve anything or understand anything or arrive anywhere. The yellow emperor's scholar has been asleep for over 2,000 years. The woman in the temple of Hathor received her dream and found her way home, and her great-great-grandchildren's great-great-grandchildren are now also long at rest. Hippocrates is dust. His wisdom somehow is not. And you tonight are breathing. Let the breath move gently. In. A long pause, out, and again. There is nothing more to do tonight. The sages have spoken. The night has received everything. And slowly, as they always have and always will, the stars complete their old, unhurried arc across the dark.